Hello all, and welcome to another episode of the Most Notorious Podcast. I'm Eric Rivenes. Well, I'm very pleased to have as my guest today, Samuel Fort. He is a former military cryptographer and intelligence analyst, and he is the author of a number of books, including the one we are going to talk about today. It is called Cult of the Great 11. Thank you so much for your time.
Eric, thank you for having me.
So let's get straight to the name of your book. What was the Cult of the Great 11?
Okay, it was a cult that was started by May Otis Blackburn and to some degree her daughter Ruth in California and in Portland, which was sort of a satellite city. The full name was actually the Divine Order of the Royal Arms of the Great 11. And it was a cult in the 1920s. It was primarily prevalent in Los Angeles, and it was at a time where there was a lot of cult activity in California. There was a lot of apocalyptic cults. Margaret Rowan had probably one of the most famous ones. And it was a cult that was particularly interesting, in my opinion, because it went so far afield from the others in its pageantry and some of its just really bizarre rituals and concepts. And when I started researching it, I realized that this just had to be captured for posterity. It's really a cult that stands out among all the others.
And just so my listeners understand, some of the stuff you're about to go into sounds pretty bizarre, but this is not a book about the paranormal. This is a book about a con artist.
Absolutely. It was really May Otis's attempt to con a lot of people out of money by promising supernatural happenings. And to some degree, she may have actually believed them, but there was no actual supernatural activity, no.
So when did you first learn about all of this, and what prompted you to write a book about it?
Well, probably around 2008. I just love research. It's been a part of my career since I was in the military. I was going online and investigating cult activity. And the reason I was doing that, I'm a big fan of H.P. Lovecraft. And I was curious, reading his books. There are several cults, of course. They're all fictional books. I was wondering, what was it that inspired H.P. Lovecraft to so often include cults in his books? And I thought, well, he was alive, obviously, in the 1920s. That's when he really put out most of his work in the early 1930s. I thought maybe there was something out there that was inspiring him. Was that something that was common back then, where he thought, well, there are cults that have a cult of Cthulhu or an esoteric order of Dagon. What inspired it? Because I hadn't really seen that in books prior to H.P. Lovecraft's. So I just really wanted to delve into the history of the 1920s and see what his possible inspiration was. And I ran across innumerable cults. It was really pretty eye-opening. But this one was the one that really stood out.
So we'll get into the specifics about this particular cult in a bit, but cults in Los Angeles in the 1920s, it was a really fascinating phenomenon. Do you know why there were so many cults concentrated there at that time?
I think it was, much like California in the 1960s. Well, I guess pretty much always. California was just a place you went to try something new. It was a more tolerant society. Back then, it was primarily really an oil state. It was an oil producer. It was the Saudi Arabia of its time. We're talking late 19-teens, 1920s. But there were also a lot of Hollywood actors, a lot of movie studios, and it was just a very open society to new ideas. So I think that was part of it. You could go to California and attempt to start a religious order or cult and not be chased down by the authorities like you might be in some other states.
So let's start with May Otis Blackburn. How far back were you able to find information about her?
Actually, I was really fortunate because there are so many online resources now. I tracked her back all the way to her birth. She was born in Storm Lake, Iowa in 1881. She and her mother, Jenny, and her father actually died at an early age, but her mother remarried. So they moved throughout the Midwest. And in 1899, when May was 16, she married a man named John Weiland. At that point, she'd had a pretty normal life, but according to May, when she recounted her past, John Weiland was a confirmed gambler and kept gambling away all their money. So the two separated. John Weiland went off to seek his fortune in the gold fields. John Weiland was a curious character. I wish I could have found out more about him. I know he was Canadian, but everything that we read about him, he was an explorer. He was a gold miner. He was always into adventure. So he took off, and that left May with Ruth. And May began dating another man named Rudolph Schultz, whom she married. And she actually concealed Ruth, her daughter's existence, from this man for some reason, and actually shuffled off Ruth to her mother. So she married Rudolph Schultz. Her mother and stepfather moved out to Oregon, and she began to tell Rudolph that she had a sister named Ruth, and she wanted Rudolph to take her to Oregon so she could be closer to her sister. So they did. Now, they were actually separated for several years, Ruth and May, and one of the results of this was that for the longest time, Ruth really thought that her grandmother was her mother. She didn't realize that May was her mother. And that was an act that May perpetuated because she was a con artist from a very early age, and she was often taking advantage of men, basically. There was a string of men that she would marry or date to get money from, and she concealed Ruth's existence because she wanted these men to think that she was available, single. She might be interested in marriage or she might not. But she still, she really did, I think, love her daughter. I think she was close to her, but she was inconvenient and when she was trying to pursue these schemes. They did move to Oregon, and at that point, and I guess I should mention here, before she married Rudolph Schultz, the reason she could marry Rudolph Schultz is because she'd received a letter from an anonymous person saying that her actual husband, John Weiland, who had left her, had been killed. So she was available for marriage. This is the story she tells. We don't know if this is actually true. She could have married Rudolph Schultz knowing that John Weiland wasn't dead, because there are a lot of things that happened later which make you think maybe she wasn't being completely honest about all this. But assuming John Weiland was dead, she married Rudolph Schultz. They moved to Oregon. He got a job as a waiter at a hotel. Now, this is around 1900. And she demanded that Rudolph give her $150 a month allowance for upkeep. And a few years into the marriage, she announced to Rudolph Schultz when he came home that John Weiland, her former husband, wasn't dead. He was alive. And so her marriage to Rudolph Schultz wasn't valid, and she was leaving him. That really floored Rudolph Schultz, of course. So she did leave him. And then there was this long, very convoluted saga where supposedly she was looking for John Weiland and he was dead and he was alive and she was asking for a divorce. But what was really going on, no one knows. It looked like she was playing some kind of game with Rudolph Schultz, using John Weiland as an excuse. But what she was really trying to do, she had met a man named Everett Fremont, who was a lumber tycoon in Portland, very wealthy man. And it looks like what she really wanted to do was become available so that she could date him and obtain some of his money. So there were several marriages. She married another man while she was perhaps married to John Weiland or perhaps married to Rudolph Schultz, who came into some money as a result of a lawsuit. After about a year, she divorced him. And that's pretty much how it went up to the point where Ruth was an adult. But at that point, May had accumulated enough money from her various schemes to start a movie company. She really loved film. She thought that Portland should be an alternative to Hollywood. She wanted to make it the next West Coast Hollywood. So she financed 2 films, and these are really kind of important historically because according to the papers of the time, these were the first full-length motion pictures made in Portland. So she hired a man who was famous for making nature films. Basically, he would go around and film scenery, and it was more educational films. His name was Muma. And she hired him to direct Ruth in a couple of films. One was called A Nugget in the Rough, and another was called A Tale of a Dress. And it looks like she greased some palms because at the movie's premiere, everyone was there, including the mayor of Portland. All the major civic organizations were present. There was huge press coverage. One of the theaters bought this gigantic organ just to play music during the films. Portland actually was really behind this. They actually held a motion picture convention in Portland, hoping that this was the start of something great. Well, the two films played for all of a week. They were very well reviewed by Portland critics and by no one else. And then they stopped their run. So May had invested all of her money in these two films with Ruth as a star, had received all this local publicity, but in the end, nobody else wanted to see the films. So they flopped. And that's really where the division comes between May's early life and the start of what would become her life as a cult priestess.
And what happens next relies heavily on this very strong connection she has with her daughter Ruth, who happened to be an exotic dancer. Tell us more about Ruth.
Sure. Well, Ruth, of course, at this point was a fairly young woman. She was 17 years old when these films were made. She still called her mother by the name of May. She knew that May was her mother, but they'd lived so long at acting as sisters that for decades they would still refer to each other as my sister. And it's not clear if that was occasionally part of an act of full reporters, but it appears that was their relationship. They were very close, though there were reports later when some reporters interviewed Ruth that she seemed what they called mentally darkened. So she loved dancing, she loved singing, and actually, I guess just to further the story, what happens is May and Ruth will go to Los Angeles. They fell to making movies in Portland. So May's idea is, that's fine, not a problem. We'll pick up everything. We'll go to Hollywood. We'll make films in Hollywood. I'll become a director. Ruth, you'll try out for some parts in movies, and we'll just start over. It doesn't work out. Ruth gets a few parts as a bit actress. No one wants to hire May for anything. You know, Ruth, of course, is very beautiful. Everyone talks about her beauty. It was a seductive beauty. It was a hypnotizing beauty. And she was considered a woman of many loves, was a phrase reporters often used. So when she couldn't find steady work as an actress, she began to take up dancing professionally to help support them. They still had some money left over, but not much. And she took up really two careers, one as a taxi dancer and the other as an Oriental dancer. Now, the taxi dancing that Ruth did, that was common in the era. There were these studios, which were taxi dancing studios. And what they would have is a large collection of girls. And men would go to these places and they would buy tickets. And they would be a dime per ticket. And if a gentleman approached one of the girls and gave her the ticket, she'd have to dance with him. That was part of the job. Now, a lot of these taxi dancing studios, as I write in my book, weren't on the up and up. A lot of them were really into prostitution. And this was just a chance for men to go in, find a girl they were attracted to, and they may or may not reach a deal to meet afterwards for something less wholesome than dancing. They weren't all like that, but apparently a great many were. She also took on dancing as an Oriental dancer. The difference between taxi dancing and Oriental dancing is that Oriental dancing, which was, again, popular at the time, is where a woman would dress up as if she were a dancer from Egypt or China or Japan or just name any exotic place. And they would dance in front of an audience. And Mata Hari was a good example of this. And the advantage of being an Oriental dancer was you could put on a very skimpy costume and dance very seductively. And you could get away with it because you would say, well, this is authentically how they dance in the Far East or Egypt or wherever. And of course, needless to say, they attracted a lot of men clientele. So Ruth seems to have really liked the Oriental dancing better. She liked to be the center of attention. And there are photos, luckily, that survive. And of course, there's one in the book of a poster of Ruth in her Egyptian outfit with her hands above her head, one leg stuck out. This was, I think the title of the poster was The Magic Circle. So she would do this dance for men, and that's also how she met the first victim of what would be the cult of the Great 11.
So while they're in Los Angeles, May's not working, as you mentioned. Ruth is dancing to pay the bills. And then there's this transition that happens, right? May stays at home and spends her time reading the Bible, and at some point something clicks in her head that she may be on to her next con.
Right. So really, while Ruth is out dancing, Ruth seems pretty happy with just dancing and making a little bit of money and dating some men and collecting money like that. But May is not happy. May is looking for the next big con. And she spends her days at home reading the Bible. Now, at some point, early after they get in L.A., Ruth marries a man named Jack Rickenbaugh. And Jack Rickenbaugh would later report that Ruth had no interest at all in religion. Not at all. May just would read her Bible, according to Jack. About 1 year after Ruth got married, she got separated from Jack and started dating some other guys from the taxi dancing place. One of them was a man named Arthur Osburn, a young man who worked in the oil fields in Los Angeles. He worked at the Sanchez Ranch, I believe, also. So Arthur was dating her, and everything was going okay. She was a little cold, but they would date. And at one point, Ruth begins asking for money because she says that her and her mother, May, are writing a book, and they need the book financed. And Arthur says, well, what kind of book is it? And she says, well, it's the book that's going to solve all the world's problems. It's called The Seventh Trumpet of Gabriel, and it's going to explain everything, how to live forever, how to find hidden gems and gold deposits, the lost measurements of Solomon, which will enable you to do anything you want to in life. And so Arthur says, well, that's interesting. Exactly where are you coming by all this knowledge? And May says that the angel Gabriel has been appearing to her and May in their home each night and dictating this book to them. And that when the book is finished, it'll bring about the apocalypse sometime in February of 1925. Arthur, we don't really know what he thought at the time. He probably thought she was joking with him or was going a little crazy, but he wanted to keep dating Ruth. So he did lend her some money, and Ruth took it. And then Ruth said, well, we need a little bit more money. Could you maybe borrow some from your employer, Sanchez Ranch? And Arthur said, sure, he could do that. And then he kind of disappeared for a while because he began to second guess this entire thing. He began to suspect he was being taken advantage of. And at that point, Ruth wrote him several letters, which would later appear in court. And we can actually read them today, which gives you some insight into how she was trying to manipulate Arthur, saying, hey, how's that loan coming about? I really miss you. Would really love to see you. We've got some great years ahead of us. If you could just get that loan from your friend, tell him we'll pay him over 1,000 times over as soon as this book is done, because we're going to be filthy rich. So eventually he did. Arthur borrowed this money, upwards of $150, which was a lot of money at the time. And he lent it to Ruth. And Ruth said, thank you. And they kept dating for a bit longer. And then she said, you know what? It's not just the book. The angel Gabriel's now told us we have to set up an entire religious order, which means buildings and all these additional costs. So we need more money. Well, at this point, Arthur's been fired for not repaying his other loans. He can't get his hands on any more money. So he tells his dad. His dad storms over to May and Ruth's house. He probably realizes what's going on. And May meets him at the door. And Arthur's dad says, basically your daughter has been taking money from our son, not paid it back. He lost his job. Give us our money back. And May goes ballistic on him. She starts screaming at him. There may have been some physical altercations, but he leaves without any money. And May follows this up by calling Arthur's mom and saying, hey, your husband's just over here. If he comes over again, I'm going to kill him. And, Arthur would later play that down, saying, he was just probably joking. But May probably wasn't joking. May probably would have killed him, as we'll, learn later. So the Arthur saga concludes with he's all dejected. He's lost his job. He goes and enlists in the army. And he goes back to May's house to say his final goodbyes. And May and Ruth are gone. The house is deserted. They're nowhere to be found. And Arthur ships off to boot camp.
So they're on their way. And this book becomes the first of many that they write. How does this thing turn from an idea to something more substantial? How do they start finding and recruiting disciples?
Right. So in many ways, Arthur was sort of at the beta. It's like, well, let's see if we can actually convince this man that we're actually getting dictation from angels and writing this book. And it worked. So May, who's really the mastermind, Ruth is an accomplice, and her good looks and charm are very valuable to May. But May's really the brain power behind this. So they go back to Portland, where they have some connections, and they basically start networking. And they build upon this story that they told Arthur, which is that the apocalypse is coming, but it's not going to be exactly like the apocalypse that the Bible described. What's going to happen is the world's going to be transformed from its current form to another form. And in this new world, there's going to be 11 queens who are going to be selected by the angel Gabriel to rule the world. And the angel Gabriel has promised these 11 queens 11 mansions, which are going to be built on an Olive Hill in Hollywood. And each of these 11 queens are going to get 12 kings as part of a harem, for lack of a better word. And they're also going to be given all of the jewels and gold in the world and great power. Well, it sounds outlandish, but, maybe 9 out of 10 people would reject this as crazy. But 1 out of 10 recipients, or whatever the actual number was, actually bought into it. And part of this was that May would bring these chests with her, and these chests contained these huge bundles of paper. And the top sheet would have all this metaphysical gibberish on it. It wouldn't make any sense to anyone. And later, reporters saw it and they said, this is absolute garbage. This means nothing. But it looked esoteric. And May would take these little drafts and she would poke them on top of 100 pages of blank paper and wrap them up with twine so you couldn't really look beneath that top page. And she would take this giant chest and say, look, I've got 30,000 pages dictated by the angel Gabriel. And if you just look at this, you can tell it's divine. And the people who believed her looked at it and actually bought into it. It's like, wow, this must be from an angel because I don't understand it. And it looks very esoteric. So they signed up. And basically what she would do is she would develop this enclave, and she got money from them, at least early on, by saying, we need support in establishing this new religion. We need to get this book financed. We can't work. She identified herself and Ruth as the 2 witnesses from Revelation. So they were actually the 2 witnesses described as being the voice persons for God at the end of the world. So there was sort of a double enticement. One, a lot of these were poor people. It was mostly women initially who were looking for a way out of poverty. They were probably fairly religious, but obviously open-minded. The idea of ruling the world from a mansion on Olive Hill in Hollywood sounded very desirable. So that's where she began to build up steam in Portland about that time.
Part of what she would do was that in exchange for money, she would offer these people titles, assign her followers special names. What were some examples of this, and why did she do it this way?
Sure. So even though she was passing off everything she said as from the Bible as a form of Christianity, as I discussed in my book, it was really almost a form of paganism. It was a form of magic that she was promising. And what she said was, the religion is very complicated because a lot of it was just made up on the fly. But when Adam and Eve had eaten from the tree of life, they had basically reversed the pump that makes the world work. The way the tree of life is supposed to work is that it pumps out the old and pumps in new. So nothing ever ages. Everything that is old is constantly being replaced by something new. That's the way the tree of life was supposed to work. And when Adam and Eve ate from the tree of life, they threw a monkey wrench into the works and made the tree of life work backwards. It became a backwards pump. So the young became old when the old were supposed to become new. So building upon that, she thought that she had to have a concord established between the earth and the spiritual realm, which meant that there was always, it kind of goes back to sort of a hermetic philosophy, as above, so below, so below as above, where anything you do on earth will be repeated or will reach a harmonic state with the universe and make things actually happen. So concords took two forms. One was rituals, which I think we'll probably talk about later. But the other is that she would actually assign these concord names to people. And these concord names were supposed to put that person in harmony with some important concept of the universe. So, for example, Gail Conde Banks was one of her followers, and his concord was the four winds of the whirlwind god. Winifred Banks was the circling of the minor scale and the harmony of music, which is a very long name to be called. Nellie Banks was the queen of the scaling breath on the inside of the body. Her mom, Jenny Blackburn, was equal balance and justice. Her own name was the North Star, or the Hill of God. There were other names like the Grand General of the North Star, the Holy Keystone, the Hereafter and Now, the Still Waters, the Gravitation Upwards, the Eternal Circle of the Taste. It just goes on and on. Basically, anyone who followed her had one of these concord names, which tied them in some positive way to the universe.
She's got a mix of followers at this point. Some seem pretty normal, on paper anyway.
Right.
And some are really creepy.
Yes.
One of them, a man that would ultimately become May's husband, was Ward Sitton Blackburn. What was his role in this organization and his relationship to May?
Right. So I guess Ward Blackburn's biggest contribution is his name. This cult is also well known as the Blackburn Cult. But, of course, he was actually the son of Walter Blackburn, who had married May's mother. Now, when May and Ruth were in Portland, they moved in with her mother and Walter Blackburn and Ward Blackburn, who at that time was her stepbrother. And at some point, it appears that they got close, which is kind of surprising because Ward Blackburn had some issues. He was allegedly a pedophile. He was supposed to have gone after children, but he also had some very curious personal habits. He would wear his clothes for days on end without washing them. He had a sort of a Fu Manchu sort of mustache. He liked to dress himself as an Oriental mystic, and it looks like he went to great lengths to make himself look Oriental with greased back hair and, like I said, this long mustache. And he was also not very smart. You know, they would interview friends later and they'd say, well, he was never quite right. But May would eventually actually marry this man who was her stepbrother. And she would assign him with really trivial duties like sitting at windows and counting cars or counting trains or measuring rain in a cup. And he took a lot of pride in these duties. He would often brag to reporters how his entire job was to sit at the window and count cars for his wife. So he wasn't the most gifted person. It's kind of funny because when this cult, when the Grade 11 was first discovered by reporters, this would be 10 years later, he was in hiding and everyone thought, aha, he's the mastermind. He's the guy behind this Blackburn cult. It's not May. May's just the person who's taken the hit, but he's the real mastermind. And as soon as they interviewed the guy, they're like, no, not the mastermind. It was May. So he was a very interesting character.
And from your accounts, there was no marital intimacy between the two. And you hint in your book that she might have been finding him girls to sort of satiate his pedophilia.
Yeah, it's unclear exactly what was going on. We do know that, like I said, he was an accused pedophile. There were several occasions where she attempted to either entice young girls into the cult or in some cases just to abduct them. There were two cases that are known where one, she went into a store and walked right up to a woman and her daughter and told the woman, you have a beautiful daughter. Will you give her to me? And if you give her to me, I'll dress her up very nice and take very good care of her. And the woman was terrified. She said no. But the woman, would say she spent the rest of her life afraid of May Blackburn, that she was going to come and abduct her daughter. And there was another case where a car stopped. She had this giant Lincoln. This is in the height of the cult. And she had a driver, very large driver. And he got out of the car while she was in it and walked up to a child who was in the front yard playing. And he was probably a foot away from abducting this child before the parent came out with a shotgun and ran them off. So there are several cases where May actually apparently attempted abductions, but there was also the case of Willa Rhodes, which I guess we'll talk about later, who was a young girl. She was 14, I think, when they first met. And she made her a queen of the cult and had her brought down to Los Angeles. And, of course, they had some tragic consequences. So it's not really clear if she was trying to pull in these young girls into the cult for reward or if she had some personal interest herself. It's just not clear. There were a lot of weird things going on.
So how does May build this empire? Much of it has to do with her charisma, wouldn't you say?
Right. Yeah. And actually a lot of reporters later, and it would come out in some of the trials, that she had a hypnotic ability about her. Later at trial, when the judge or the lawyers would say, how could you believe such outlandish stuff? Every one of them, and some of these were some very educated people, would say, you'd have to know her. If you talk to this woman, I know all this sounds crazy now, but when she says it to you, you believe it. She had that certain quality, and I think, we hear about this with other cult leaders. They just got this magic about them where they can tell you to do the most preposterous things. And for whatever uncanny reason, people believe it. And of course, this happens with other cult leaders, right? We talk about Charles Manson or any number of others where you would think, looking back at history shows, how would anyone actually believe what they're being told? But they do. Now, May was also targeting a very good audience initially, the impoverished who were looking for a better life. She was also reaching out to a lot of Christian scientists and fringe Christian scientists. And she would sort of cater her doctrine according to her audience. So for them, she would appeal to their belief system. And one of her earliest recruits was a woman named Arthur Rhodes, who was very prominent in Christian Science circles in Klamath County, Oregon. She and her husband, William, they were the parents of a girl named Willa Rhodes. And Martha Rhodes actually had her own. The people at the time called it a cult. It was at least an organization of faith healers who practiced ritual healing. And Martha was to the point where she claimed she could raise the dead. She claimed that she'd raised herself back from the dead, which is a pretty neat trick. So she pulled Martha into her circle, and Martha brought her own group of followers. Pretty much anyone you see from Portland or the Oregon area that was in the early cult, a lot of those came from Martha. So Martha and May together. Martha, though, was different from May. May was a con artist. She may or may not have had delusions about some of the things she said. It seems like she might have actually believed some of them, but it looks like in most cases she was just making stuff up. Martha was a true believer. She actually believed she could raise the dead. She thought she could heal people. So she wasn't involved in the con, but she did bring a lot of people in who trusted Martha. And one of these was Gail Banks, who's a very prominent, a very well-educated figure, very smart. He would actually become May's translator. He would send, and this is interesting, Martha actually called up Gail Banks and said, I've met this woman, May Otis Blackburn. It's amazing. I think she really is one of the two witnesses of God. I think she has fantastic insights. I want you to go to Boston, where the headquarters of the Church of Christian Science was at the time. I'm sorry, I'm not sure what the actual institution's name is. It's in the book. And I want you to tell them that May Otis is a prophetess and that they need to actually make her part of the religious establishment. And amazingly, Gail, again, he's a very smart guy. He's a sergeant major at a military academy. He quits his job. He goes to Boston. He goes and says, hey, this woman's a prophetess. You need to accept her as a prophetess. And they basically kick him out the door, and he's taken off the rolls of Christian Science, which he's been a member of for like 20 years. So he goes back, but he's still a believer. So all this weird menagerie of people who are poor just looking for something to believe in, Christian scientists who aren't really necessarily Christian scientists. They start off as Christian scientists, but they go much further afield. They get in a very wobbly orbit around mainstream Christian science. There's also people who are just greedy. May is promising gold and jewels and all this hidden power. And there are some people who are like, well, I don't really believe much of that, but what if it is true? I could just throw a few dollars at this and see if it pays off. So it was a huge collection, and May was just very good at surveying the people around her, seeing what their needs were, and using her basically hypnotic powers to pull these people into her orbit. It was tricky maybe getting them to stay there, but she also had Ruth, who was very attractive, and people like Gail Banks, who were very smart at writing stuff up. So she had a lot of resources available to her.
At this cult's peak, how much money did she have? What were her assets?
Well, so they moved into a house in Los Angeles at 640 South Manhattan. That became sort of the cult dorm, a very nice place, just sort of a mansion. It was a very big house. It was rented to them by a couple called Edna and Frank Vogel, who were millionaires, real estate millionaires. There's some debate about how much money they may or may not have given to the cult, but I'm gonna guess some. She also got a lot from her followers, but especially her followers' relatives. She would convince her followers to give her money that might be from life insurance. If a relative's husband or wife had died, she would ask for that money. If they had some sort of military pension, she would ask for that money. If they'd come to any kind of windfall at all, she would ask for that money. She also prohibited any of the men in the cult from working. This was a very female-oriented cult. All the offices were held by women. All the spokespeople were women. And most of the men were prohibited from working, or if they were allowed to work, they had to turn over their paychecks to May. So May was collecting all the paychecks from all the men and also all the females. She was getting donations. She would sell the Concords, these fancy names that she would give to people to put them in harmony with the universe. She would sell them, depending on who the audience was, for between $500 and $2,000. It depended on the target. She also had little pamphlets that she was circulating around Los Angeles, which would eventually get the LA prosecutors' attention, basically saying February 1925 will be the end of the world, but it's going to be a better world. And if you're anxious for this to come, it's not going to happen until I publish this book called The Great Sixth Seal. The thing is, we have to work. So if you really want the apocalypse to come sooner, send me some money and we'll get the book done sooner. So she was selling sponsorships to the apocalypse, essentially. And there were a lot of people who sent her money. When it was all said and done, I think at trial they estimated that in the course of about 3 years, she collected $300,000. And this was mid-1920s. It was a lot of money.
How did she maintain her congregation? What was keeping them there? What did she offer them? And the rituals, what were some examples of the rituals that they were performing?
Right. So there's a lot of mystery surrounding that. We know that, like I said earlier, a lot of it sounds actually very, very pagan. We know that she was involved in dog sacrifice. There were a lot of accounts of her followers sacrificing dogs or other animals, but mostly dogs. And they would bury the bones and then dig them up and then transfer them to some other place for other rituals. There were also accounts there were these magic acts. She had apparently a fellow con artist by the name of Burpo. And he was very good at pyrotechnic tricks, making doors slam, making these phantom voices appear as if it was like a seance. And she would have these large meetings, and she would have this guy come in and do this, and the congregation was just awed. It was proof that she was really who she said she was. And he probably got a kickback, I'm sure, for all that work. But a lot of it was these pyrotechnic tricks, these little seance tricks, the ritual. And I think part of it, too, was a lot of these rituals are sort of unsavory. I mean, animal sacrifice in the 1920s was not common by any means. So once you participated in some of this and once you gave up all your money, you were sort of hooked in because you had probably done certain things that you wouldn't want made public. You really had no money. You were completely dependent on this woman because she would take all the funds from all of her followers and purchase small amounts of food or whatever they needed to live on. So she'd taken complete control of everyone's finances. There was also intimidation, and this, as the cult got larger, and eventually now they're going to migrate from Los Angeles to Simi Valley and actually build an actual compound, which is where they're going to build this giant temple with fancy furniture, and they'll have more ritual acts. But she also got into strong-arming her followers. She actually convinced a lot of the men. There were guns involved, and if anyone tried to leave, first she would threaten them with God's vengeance. She would say things like, your bones are going to turn to dust if you try to leave this cult. Well, she didn't call it a cult, the religious movement. If that didn't work, she was prone to just having the followers stalked. And in some cases, when they tried to leave, she had them physically brought back in. Now some did make it out and others didn't. It's unclear why some did and others didn't. But in most cases, it was a combination of bribery, fear, extortion, blackmail, or just people who genuinely believed that she was from God.
You've already talked a bit about Willa Rhodes, a very lovely young girl, you write, and May becomes infatuated with her.
Right. And Willa Rhodes, that's the girl who I dedicated the book to. She's really the tragic figure at the center of this. Like, so she was the adopted daughter of Martha and William Rhodes. Martha was the person who followed May, who believed she could raise the dead, and she saw a lot in May. So when May told Martha that she wanted to make Willa a queen or priestess, and they were kind of used interchangeably, those two terms, priestess or queen. She wanted to make her a queen of the cult, and she wanted to give her the moniker, the Concord, the Tree of Life. So that was very important. The Tree of Life was at the center of May's theology. She said, all you've got to do is bring her down to Los Angeles. We're going to set her up at our headquarters at 640 South Manhattan. Everyone's going to love her. She's going to be treated as a queen, should be. And Martha and William Rhodes, at first, they didn't go initially. William had some reservations. William didn't really buy into all this, but he wanted to keep his wife happy. So he resisted for a long time going from Portland back down to Los Angeles, where May had set up her cult headquarters. But eventually, around November of 1924, Martha convinces William that they need to do the move. So they sell all their belongings, sell all their possessions. They put Willa in their car. They drive down to Los Angeles. They get to the cult headquarters, and Willa is immediately greeted, as a champion. Like, she is treated like royalty. And she's at this point, I believe, 16. And she's treated so well. In fact, Jenny, who is May's mother, greets the girl by bringing her 7 puppies and says, hey, here's 7 puppies for a queen. These are going to be your best friends. And the girl's just ecstatic, right? It's like, wow, this is a beautiful place. Los Angeles is wonderful. It's sunny. It's warm. All these people love me. I've got 7 new puppies. So life is really nice. But in December of that year, she gets a tooth infection. And it's really bad. And because of her mother's beliefs, and probably because May doesn't want to give her any money, they don't get it treated. And it's not uncommon at that time, as I wrote in my book, there was a lot of suspicion of dentists. A lot of people thought if you went to a dentist, they used unsanitized tools and it would actually make things worse. So just wait it out. So she's got this infected tooth, and this infection is getting worse and worse to the point where she's actually bedridden. She gets a fever. She gets her throat begins to swell. And this is only a month after Willa arrives in Los Angeles. So they're all around praying for her, and she's not getting any better, and they're very concerned. But then, miraculously, the day before January 1st, the day before the new year, 1925, Willa gets out of bed. She seems perfectly fine. She walks downstairs. She's talking to people. Everyone's like, fantastic. Our prayers have paid off. May's powers are showing themselves. She's healed. But then on the next day, which is New Year's Day, she's back in bed, and she's extremely sick again. And she summons her father and a few other people to come to her room. And she's laying there in bed. And she's looking very weak, very tired. And essentially she asks the people who are brought into this room whether they love her. Of course, they all say they do. And she says, she loves them also. And it's got this weird vibe is going on. This is an odd conversation for this girl to be having. And she had an argument with another cult member just a week before named Dora Searing. And so she has Dora come into the room. And she says, Dora, do you love me? And Dora says, I do. She says, do you forgive me? Are we basically okay? The argument's forgotten. And Dora says, yes. So she kisses Dora, lies down, and dies. Just like that. So it's curious. We can talk about this at length, I guess, but it was New Year's Day, only a month after Willa arrived, that she died. And knowing how May liked concords and harmonics, there was a lot of suspicion later on that maybe Willa didn't die from an infected tooth, that maybe something more nefarious had happened. And there were police who interviewed the Rhodes later on who said that one or both of them had said something about poison possibly being involved. And even at the time, Martha Rhodes said that the girl was sacrificed for the world. But when they asked her about that, she said, well, what I meant is that it was necessary that she die. But she wasn't killed. She died naturally, but that was just God's will. So some very suspicious circumstances around the death of this unfortunate young girl who was taken down to Los Angeles by the cult.
So if that's not strange enough, right?
Right.
What Martha does with her daughter's body next is even more bizarre.
Right. So the only person who wasn't present, supposedly, when Willa Rhodes died is May Blackburn. May is living in a separate house. This cult headquarters, as fancy as it is very crowded. She's had the entire house reconverted into basically like these tiny little dorm rooms. And it's not good enough for her. She's a high priestess, so she has her own house. So someone calls up May and says, oh, we got a problem here. Willa's dead. So May flies over in her car, and supposedly she goes into hysterics. Why Willa? Why did it have to be Willa? One wonders in retrospect if this was an act or even just a tell that it never actually happened. But supposedly she was very distraught, and she left for a few hours. Then she came back, and basically there's a lot of debate going on amongst the cultists present about what they should do with the body. They know this looks very bad. Some want to burn the body. Others say, well, we just need to tell the police what happened. But May says, no, I just heard from an angel, and they said we need to wait a little while before we do anything, that Willa will be resurrected. So we definitely don't want to bury her. She's going to be resurrected. What we need to do is preserve her body for the resurrection. So what they do is they go out and get these large blocks of ice, they put them in the bathtub, and they take Willa's body and they put it on top of the ice. At this point, Jenny Blackburn, who's May's mother, does something that's extremely suspicious to say the least. She would later claim that one of the 7 puppies that she gave Willa had died on its own, and that she decided it was only proper that the other puppies also be with Willa. So she chloroformed them to put them to sleep, and they spontaneously died. And they put the 7 puppies around Willa's body in a ritualistic fashion. So only hours after, Willa had died, she's in the bathroom on this giant slab of ice, surrounded by her 7 dead puppies that had been given to her only about a month before. Eventually, May says, we can't keep her here, obviously. This building is full of followers. We need to move her somewhere else. So we need to get her out of here and over to a house I have on Vermont. So they take Willa, and somehow, and everyone in the house at the time said they didn't see a thing, but they take Willa's corpse and the corpse of the 7 puppies out of the house. They prop Willa up in the back seat of a car, put the puppies in a trunk or in a box. They drive them to this Vermont house, and they establish a crypt there, which is they take one of the bedrooms. they convert it to the point where they can put ice in there, and they put Willa's body on this ice. They take the 7 puppies, they put them around Willa, and every day for actually several weeks, they just leave her there. They're bringing fresh roses every day to honor her body, but she's essentially lying in state. Now, a few weeks after that, May says, well, we can't keep doing this. We need to move her body to a place where it's going to be harder to find, because she's going to get resurrected. It's just a matter of time. It's taking longer than we expected, but it's going to happen. So they move her to another house, and this time she doesn't get the royal treatment. They build this little additional shack onto the house, just a few feet tall, and they put Willa in there in this sort of makeshift coffin that her father makes. Her father was a handyman. He used to work in a lumber mill, and so he builds her like this little coffin, and they fill it with ice. And the 7 puppies are still with her in a separate box. And we would later find out when one of the trials began that there was a nice delivery man who had come to this house, and he was bringing 600 pounds of ice a week to the house, because that's what it took in the Los Angeles weather to preserve the body. And at one point he asked, it was an innocent question. He had no idea there was a body in the house, but he asked the Rhodes, why do you need 600 pounds of ice for your house? And they came up with this ludicrous response that, well, we melt it down for water for our religious services, which, of course, is a preposterous answer, but it was the best they could come up with. Now, this went on for several months before May finally went to the Rhodes and said, you know what? The resurrection is just not imminent. She's not going to rise from the dead anytime soon. So we need to bury her in a more permanent fashion. She had them buy a house out in Venice at a place called Marco Place. And she said, we're going to bury your daughter, but we're going to bury her in such a fashion that when she rises from the dead, she's going to have access to the surface. So William Rhodes and another cult member by the name of Floyd Miller tore up the floorboards of one of the bedrooms, and they dug these cavities in the ground beneath it. They built 2 new coffins, and they copper lined them and welded the seams to make them waterproof. And they buried these coffins into the ground, but like I said, they only went about 2 feet. So basically when the lid covered the coffin, the lid was still above the earth. And they put the dogs in one of them. Now, while they're doing this, Martha Rhodes has gone off to a druggist. And according to the druggist, his testimony later was that she had this ancient script with her, with this ancient recipe. And she had him put together these spices and all these drugs and ointments and bottled it. And it cost her like $25. She took it back. While the men were still digging the graves, she began doing basically a surface embalmment of Willa's body to preserve it. Now, this is strictly superficial. It was on her skin. There was no internal embalming like the Egyptians did. And then they had Willa wrapped up in a white cloth along with the dogs. They put her in a ritual position, which was with her knees drawn up to her chest and her arms over her knees on her side in this coffin. They put the lids on the coffins of Willa and the 7 murdered puppies, for lack of a better word, because they surely were killed. Put the floorboards back on loosely with the thought, at least the Rhodes legitimately thought, that Willa and or the dogs were going to come back to life. So this entire thing was set up so that when Willa did wake up, she would be able to move the lid off the coffin, move the floorboards aside, and crawl up to the surface, which is one of the creepiest things I can imagine, because this was the bedroom her parents slept in. So every night for what would become years, they were sleeping directly above the mummified body of their daughter and these dogs, waiting for their daughter to wake up and knock on the floor, or just to move the floorboards aside. It's a scene straight out of a horror movie if you think about it, but this was their great hope.
Yeah, that's just gruesome. Just gruesome.
Yeah, it's remarkable.
There are a lot of really interesting stories in this book, and we obviously won't be able to get to all of them today, of course. But I want to ask you about Sam Rizzio, Ruth's husband, who seemed to have disappeared under mysterious circumstances, right?
Right. So what happened was in 1924, when they first moved to when May and Ruth had first started setting up their cult headquarters at 640 South Manhattan, Ruth started dating a young Italian American, 17 years old at the time, by the name of Samuel Rizzio, and knew about what was going on as far as Ruth had some very peculiar beliefs. She was surrounded by some very peculiar people. It all seemed very weird. He was a straight Catholic guy, but he did have a troubled family past. His father was wanted for a triple homicide related to the Black Hand, which was sort of a early form of mafia. A lot of it, Italian Americans were involved in. So his father was on the run. He was living with his mother in Los Angeles, but after a few months of dating, he and Ruth married. And it was sort of an unusual situation because he married her probably thinking that once they get married, he's going to convince Ruth to move out of this place with all these weird people. They're going to set up a new home. It's going to be a very traditional family, right? He's going to be the head of the family. He'll get a job. He'll provide for Ruth. But that's not what happened. When he tried to get Ruth to leave the cult, she said, "No, I'm a queen. I have all the power in the world. We're making good money here. Why would I want to give all this up?" And that made him angry. And there's different accounts. Ruth, May, and some of the other Blackburns and cult members later say that Sammy was violent, and that one time he struck Ruth, and that was what led to events that followed. It is possible that he was violent, but Sammy was never around to defend himself. So what happened was, supposedly, one day Sammy struck Ruth on the head during an altercation, and he left the house. This is the Blackburn story. He left the house and he never came back. And that was the end of it. He just took off. He was just so upset he couldn't bear it anymore. Now, what actually came out later was that he and Ruth were having frequent arguments, and May didn't approve of the marriage. So May requested one of the cult members, Eleanor Sandrosky. She was a pharmacist. Her and her husband were both members of the Divine Order. Eleanor Sandrosky's concord was the rainbow. And she summoned Sandrosky to her house, and she said, "I've just heard from an angel. I've got a new command. Now, stay to yourself because this is unbelievable. But the angel Gabriel says we must kill Samuel Rizzio." And Sandrosky's like, "We have to what?" And she says, "We have to kill Samuel Rizzio. It's an order from an angel. And he said that we need a poison. It needs to be the kind of poison that can't be traced. Could you maybe cook something up like that for us so we could get this over with?" And Sandrosky, she's stunned. You don't just say no to May. She had that kind of power. So she said, "I don't know. I'll have to go and talk to my husband." And May soft pedals and says, "Fine, go talk to your husband, see what you can do. But when you can, get me this poison." So Eleanor goes back. She talks to her husband, and her husband's like, "No, this has gone too far. We know something's wrong. We kind of bought into the early preachings of May, but she's gone too far this time. We're going to quit the cult. Go back and tell her we're quitting the cult." Sandrosky goes back and says, "We're quitting the cult." And May says, No, you're not. This is your husband's evil influence on you. He's not your right husband. I want you to marry another man. And she brings this other man into the room and says, "You're going to marry Eleanor." And he says, "But I've already got like 2 other wives that you made me marry. You're going to marry her anyways." And she actually goes off in this, really this tirade. Basically says, "Look, if you don't give me the poison, your bones are going to crumble to dust." So Sandrosky leaves. Later on, they have another meeting. And now May is really soft pedaling it. She says, "I think you misunderstood. We don't need to actually kill Samuel Rizzio. We're going to have a ceremony. And the ceremony is going to be a whirling dervish ceremony. The problem is Samuel is acting the way he does with my daughter because he's got 10 dead priests on his shoulder, some sort of metaphysical curse. So we're going to take this poison and we're going to make a circle around him with this poison. He's going to swirl 10 times around. And he's going to say, 'I'm a dead priest.' After he does these 10 spins, he'll be free of these metaphysical priests, and he'll be a healthy member of the cult." I mean, it sounds kind of like brainwashing. So Eleanor's like, "Oh, well, okay, if it's just a ceremony, sure. So do you actually need poison?" And May says, well, here's the thing. The angel Gabriel told me, even though this is only a ceremony, it's got to be real poison. So Eleanor goes back and tells her husband, and her husband says, okay, we've got to quit this. But Eleanor knows that May is going to be coming for the poison. So she says later that she mixes some colored dye with water, and she's going to give this to May as the poison. The next day, a woman named Mary Stewart, her concord was the ointment of God. She's basically the courier and personal assistant for May Blackburn, shows up at the pharmacy, gets the poison, also gets a bottle of chloroform, which apparently was also needed for the ceremony, and disappears. And at that point, the Sandrowskis actually quit the cult and aren't harassed anymore. Shortly after that, they said they had the ceremony. This is the Blackburn's account. They had the ceremony. They went to a beach. Sammy did his spins. He got free of the angels or the dead priests that were haunting him. His behavior was corrected. And at that point, he took off. So we have some very different accounts of what happened to Samuel Rizzio, but he never reappeared. I actually, not too many months ago, I actually heard from one of the descendants of the Rizzio family who had stumbled upon my book somehow, and he confirmed, he said, we never knew what happened to Samuel Rizzio. I had never even seen, he was the nephew of Samuel Rizzio. He said, I'd never even seen a picture of my Uncle Samuel until I saw your book and saw the newspaper picture in it. And he said, when he was growing up, there were all these little whispers about what might have happened to Sammy way back when, but they didn't really like talking about it. But he never resurfaced. The man disappeared. So, you can make your own decision about what happened to him. Maybe he did run off to Chicago to join his father, avenge his father's death. His father died some years later. But it's very suspicious, the circumstances of his disappearance.
So the whirling dervish ceremony, you just sort of spin around?
Right. This was May's account at trial, years later, is that basically the ceremony, if you made 10 spins in sand with a circle of poison around you, and you said, I am a dead priest, I am a dead priest, I am a dead priest. After 10 rotations, the 10 dead priests would fly away from you, and your mind would be free, and you would realize that May's theology is the right theology. So essentially she was saying he was too Catholic. He will do this ceremony as commanded by the angel of Gabriel, and he'll be free. It'll be a ceremonial death. This was her later story. So he's not really going to be killed. It's a ceremonial death. But of course, knowing what we know, it seems likely that he was probably killed.
So please, for anyone out there thinking about trying this at home, don't do it.
Right. Or at least if you use poison, make sure it's the colored water type.
It's interesting that he would want to participate in something like this. He wanted to leave, right? He didn't want anything to do with this cult.
No, my suspicion would be that you recall that Mary Stewart also got a bottle of chloroform. And that's well documented. So chloroform was not supposed to be part of this ceremony. So we can only, use conjecture at this point, but it seems most likely that at some point May got tired of Sammy and his altercations with Ruth. She didn't want Ruth leaving. And there's a very good likelihood that he was just chloroformed in his sleep or something and poisoned, and they managed to dispose of his body. And all this stuff about whirling dervish ceremonies was made up years later to try to explain why the poison was needed.
So how did things start to unravel for the Blackburns? Right.
So oddly enough, it comes about as a result of one of May's earliest and richest followers. It was a man named Clifford Dabney. Clifford Dabney was the nephew of J.B. Dabney, who was the owner of the Dabney Oil Syndicate, which was making a lot of money. He was a millionaire. He gave a lot of his money to educational institutions. And it's also notable in that while during the same period, Raymond Chandler, the famous writer, actually worked for Dabney. I think he started out as a secretary, got as high as vice president before he was actually fired because of alcoholism. So there's a real possibility that Raymond Chandler may have come into contact with some of these Blackburn individuals. But essentially, the deal was J.B. Dabney operated the oil fields, and he hired his nephew, Clifford Dabney, to go and find properties that they could lease to put oil fields on. So Clifford made money by trying to find property that he could buy or rent, transferring those titles to his uncle, and he'd get a share of the profits. Somehow he got in contact with May Blackburn. Well, actually, May Blackburn got in contact with him. It's not clear exactly who this intermediary was. They said there was an elderly woman who knew both of them. So he and his wife go and talk to May. Actually, now Clifford Dabney and his wife, very wealthy, plenty of money, very well educated, upstanding citizens. So they're not like some of the other members of the cult who are the downtrodden and poor uneducated. And May says, well, if you're looking for oil, my book that I'm about to publish, The Great Sixth Seal, and by the way, she changed the name. It used to be The Seventh Trumpet of Gabriel. She changed it to The Great Sixth Seal. They're all made up books. It didn't matter. She would use whatever name she wanted to at the time. But she says, when I publish this book, it's going to have Solomon's Lost measurements in it. It will tell you how to find the oil. Gold, gems, anything. It can also find oil. Now, Clifford Dabney was involved. Apparently, he had some pretty interesting beliefs. There were a lot of accusations made against him later by cultists saying that, you think we've got crazy beliefs. This guy's got really crazy beliefs. But that was at trial, and they were trying to protect May. So there's no telling what the veracity of their stories were. So anyway, Clifford agrees. He says, okay, fine, I'll help finance your book because I really would like to find these oil reserves. And he ends up giving her a few $1,000s. He buys a Concorde. His Concorde is the hereafter and now. He gets his wife a Concorde. She becomes the Holy Keystone. And he also buys them huge tracts of land out in the Santa Susana Hills at a place called Mortimer Park at the time. So over the years, he invests more and more money in this cult, hoping for this book to be published to the point of actually financing a printing press to try to make it happen faster. The entire time actually believing she's writing a book being dictated by angels, which will make him wealthier through oil leases. And she was very good at bringing him along for the entire journey by making these promises. And she also made him president at one point, which was an absolutely pointless title. It meant nothing, in the cult. They would involve them in rituals, and it went on and on to the point where eventually Clifford Dabney, after several failed attempts because May intimidated him, but finally in 1929, Clifford goes to the authorities and says, I've been defrauded. May Blackburn's the woman. I want to sue her. I want all my money back. And the police at the time were like, so you gave this woman all your money because she was promising you this stuff? You really don't have much of a basis. You're free to believe. She was promising you supernatural results. We can't really hold a woman to anything because it's just like if she were a preacher or a priest, they make promises of supernatural events, but you can't go sue them when they don't happen. So initially, they're not very sympathetic to his case, but he is fairly wealthy and he has some influence. So they start looking into it. And as a result of that, at the Santa Susana Colony, we skipped over a lot of the history there, but there had been some deaths. And they start looking into those deaths, and they publicize that they're looking into these deaths. And what happens is reports start coming in from all over the place. Relatives of the cultists who haven't seen their relatives for a long time start writing and saying, hey, I heard so-and-so was there, and they've been missing for years. But the most important part was when someone called and said, do you know a girl named Willa Rhodes? And the police like, no idea. They said, well, you need to talk to their parents because she's dead. And the police said, well, what do we do? They give, basically this anonymous caller gives the police the address of William and Martha Rhodes. So they go down there, they show up. There's this very awkward conversation where the police are actually saying, we heard that your daughter's died. We need to know where she is. Martha goes into hysterics. Eventually, the police convince the Rhodes to come clean, and they start tearing up the floorboards and recovering the body of Willa Rhodes and the dogs. And because this was the 1920s, the press are on it immediately. The press are in the front line. They're everywhere. They're taking pictures of the coffins. The police actually open one of the coffins and the mummified dogs in there, and they take pictures of this. And there's these pictures are still available. So at that point, that's a huge story, and it goes nationwide. So that's when all the dirty laundry of the cult, and there's a lot of dirty laundry we didn't talk about, obviously, but everything comes out. May gets arrested because it's supposed that she may have murdered or made several people disappear, in addition to Rizzio, in addition to Willa Rhodes. So she defends herself. Eventually, I guess to cut to the chase, she is found guilty of eight charges of grand theft, and she's sentenced to go to San Quentin. And her attorney, a man named Cochran, appeals the verdict. So she's actually go to San Quentin. She's been being held in Los Angeles. And her attorney, Cochran, goes to the Supreme Court of California and says, this is unfair. This is a religious matter. Deputy knew what he was doing. All this other evidence that was introduced during the trial about Willa Rhodes' death, about Rizzio's disappearance, has nothing at all to do with this case. Those were prejudicial to May. The only thing that should have been considered is, did my client defraud Dabney by making these promises, which were made in the sphere of religious belief? And the Supreme Court found for May. They said, you're right. Yes, all this other stuff was absolutely insane. This is the craziest stuff we've ever heard. And that's pretty much what's actually right in their opinion. But none of that matters. She was accused of fraud. And we don't see any evidence of fraud. Clifford Dabney and the other people who followed May are like anyone else. They can believe what they want. If they want to give money to a religious cause, they can. They can ask for the money back later if they don't get what they're promised. That's just the nature of our country. You have freedom to practice religion. So ultimately, the Blackburn cult didn't dissolve at that time. It actually went on for decades longer, but it lost all its momentum. It never gained any new members. It stayed intact more or less for 10 years. It relocated a few times. Members began to slowly fade away, but that was essentially the end. Who knows what might have happened had Dabney not decided to actually make a civil suit. It might have gone on further. That was pretty much a nail in the coffin for May's ambitions.
One of the crazier things about this story is where the newspapers went with all of this. The reporters writing these sensational stories once news of this cult broke open, their imaginations just went wild.
Oh, right. You think about all the things that the reporters had to work with. Ward Blackburn, his crazy appearance, his stories about counting cars and collecting rain as part of ritual. There was another concord in the form of ritual where May required her mother, Jenny Blackburn, to be chained to her bed for 2 months. And there was like this long chain connected to her bed that she could go up and down the steps. But she literally chained her mother to a bed for 2 months. And her mother said it was fine. I had no problem with it. It was commanded by an angel, so that's fine. They had these rituals where a horse was hung upside down. They had new trucks purchased so they could be sacrificed as part of concords. It just went on and on and on. And of course, the darker side where you had Sam Rizzio disappeared, you had Willa Rhodes being dying under suspicious circumstances and then essentially mummified and buried beneath her parents' floorboards. You couldn't make this stuff up. If you put this stuff in fiction, your editor would say you've gone too far. But this all really happened. And that's, again, is why this cult really interested me, because every day there was something new, and this all actually happened. It is so, well, I guess it's been long enough now where we can say it was colorful. At the time, it was this bizarre combination of tragedy and comedy and insanity.
So what really fascinates me about all of this is who knew what, who was in on the grift, and who really believed all of this. You've already said that May herself obviously set this up as a con, but might have started believing her own fiction. But May's own mother bought it all and believed her daughter was conversing with angels and directing her.
Right. And that's the hardest part in all of this, is knowing what May or her mother or Ruth or any of them in the cult actually believed. May was interviewed by psychologists later, and they basically said, she's not perfectly stable. She's what they call hysterical, but I think that means mentally troubled. They said Ruth was mentally darkened. Jenny seemed completely out of it. But yeah, it's difficult to say. I think, probably Martha was a true believer for a long time, probably up until Willa Rhodes wasn't resurrected. May was at heart a con artist, but I think she actually had some issues where she began to believe what she taught. Ruth, for the rest of her life, seems to have actually believed some of this. She was writing pamphlets into the 70s about some of the cult's theology. At least they were copyrighted. We don't know what happened with them. Was she circulating them? We don't know, but this was decades later. Gail Banks, who was really probably the smartest person in the outfit, he knew a lot of history. He studied Greek philosophy and stuff like that. And I think, honestly, he was supposed to be translating the angel's visions that May received. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of this was, when we say interpretation, maybe he actually authored some of this, because some of the, if you read some of May's writings, and she did actually publish one book called The Origin of God. And if you read it, it's all metaphysical gibberish, but it's pretty sophisticated metaphysical gibberish. So it's possible that he actually authored some of these ideas and concepts and just passed them on to May, and May passed them on to her believers. Mary Stuart, basically, a lot of these, the Divine Order of the Great 11, and there's another sister organization, the Divine Science of Joshua, they were incorporated. And the incorporation documents listed people who would get shares and profits from these religious orders. And I have to think almost anyone who signed those documents, like Mary Stuart, for example, had to be on the inside, right? I mean, they're one of the principles of the corporations. Generally speaking, most of the poorer and more impoverished people, they were never on these things. So yeah, I think there were some people who were really insiders who realized this entire thing was a con. There were others who were absolute true believers for the rest of their lives. And then there were people like perhaps May, Ruth, and a few others who got reality and fiction conflated, but they were making money at it, so they just kept it going as long as they could.
There are a ton of television shows these days about all of these modern day cults. You'd think people would learn from history, right? The same tactics May used to rope followers in the 1920s are still being used today.
It's true. It's and a lot of the cults that were concurrent, even back in the 1920s, were doing the exact same thing. And it's always pretty much the same process, right? Where you find some people, you say that you're a representative of God, that God's appointed you for some special purpose, and that you as a follower need to give up all your worldly possessions and give them to the cult leader. And there might be little miracles here and there. And at some point, there's going to be some great apocalyptic event or revelation, which of course never happens. And it usually ends in tragedy or death. Yeah, it's the same thing again and again. But I'm not sure that'll ever stop. Maybe it's just human psychology where every generation has to learn this lesson for itself.
Exactly. So tell us where people can get your book and tell us about your website.
Oh, sure. So the book, Amazon.com is the best source. There's other retailers, but that's where I'd like to direct folks to. Also, I have an author's page at Amazon, and you can also visit my website, which is just samuelfort.com, spelled just like it sounds. And I will, on that website, I do have some pictures posted, and I do go in there on occasion because I still research this. I still find new little tidbits here and there. Sometimes I get contacted by readers who give me information. And when I get that, I post it. So the book is written, but the story keeps going. There's always something new to be found. And it also has some of my other books there also.
Well, excellent. Thank you again for your time.
No, I appreciate it very much. I appreciate your patience. And I realize sometimes I just go on and on, but I never know when to stop and talking about this subject.
It's a fascinating subject. I don't blame you. Again, I've been speaking to Samuel Fort, author of Cult of the Great 11. This has been another episode of the Most Notorious Podcast, broadcasting to every dark and cobwebbed corner of the world. I'm Eric Rivenes, and have a safe tomorrow.
This is Stacy on her motorcycle.
What an incredible view!
And this is Stacy off her motorcycle.
Does this have sucralose in it?
On her motorcycle.
Oh, the wind in my hair!
Off her motorcycle.
It's pronounced et cetera, not etc.
On.
Woohoo! Yes!
Off.
No.
You're better on your bike. And with basic policy starting at $75 a year, quote today at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Annual premium for basic liability policy not available in all states.